The hearing will please come to order. Contrary to belief held by many Americans, we may not see the show. Chairman Hamilton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Members will recall that Congressman Cheney had 20 minutes reserved on his time, so the Chair recognizes Congressman Cheney at this time for 20 minutes for the purpose of asking questions. Congressman Cheney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I think on behalf of many of us, Mr. Corder and Senator McClure and others who spoke to this issue, we feel very, very strongly that given the line of questioning developed by counsel for the committee, it's only fair that Colonel North have the opportunity to present that information that was a part of his briefing with respect to the question of what kind of efforts he made in providing information to American citizens who ultimately cooperated in and supported fundraising efforts for the Contras. Colonel North, in the time remaining to me, I would like to ask you to give us a general description of your briefing, if you will. I'm especially interested in putting on the public record as part of these hearings information about the nature and the extent of the Soviet threat in Central America and Nicaragua.
All right, sir. Perhaps the best way to do that is to simply go through the presentation as it exists, and I will try to quickly go through the slides and indicate what I would have said had the slides been up on the screen. The first slide simply demonstrates the geography and why this part of the world seems to be of so much interest to the Soviets. The first slide shows the effect of Soviet penetration in this hemisphere in the form of a consolidated communist regime in Cuba and the threat that poses to our sea lines of communication, both to Europe and through the Panama Canal, and the threat it poses to 55% of our oil supplies coming up from Latin America. The second slide is a photograph of Andrei Gromyko, then the foreign minister of the Soviet Union, and a quote from Mr. Gromyko to the effect that he said in Moscow in 1983, "The region is boiling like a cauldron. Cuba and Nicaragua are living examples for the countries in that part of the world," talking about their intentions. A second quote from Marshal Ogorkov, then the head of the Soviet Armed Forces, in Moscow when he was talking to Maurice Bishop, then the head of Grenada, in which he said, a note taken by Bishop and his people in visiting Moscow in March of '83, the Marshal said, forgive me, the Marshal said that over 2 decades ago there was only Cuba in Latin America. Of the emergency aid station and intensive care unit, which is nothing more than a field tent without even mosquito netting. A photograph of the plastic maps that they were forced to draw their own battle plans and patrol routes on because we couldn't even give them that. And then finally a photograph showing the grave of a resistance fighter. And the conclusion of the briefing is, gentlemen, that we've got to offer them something more than the chance to die for their own country and the freedoms that we believe in. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Colonel North. I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thank you very much. The Chair is pleased to recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Senator Nunn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Colonel North, it may have been covered during these proceedings, and I may have missed it, but I have never heard the answer to a question that I think is rather important before we get testimony from Admiral Poindexter, and that is, to the best of your knowledge, was Admiral Poindexter aware that Director Casey of the CIA knew about what we've called diversion, what you've called residual fund for the Contras? Going down to a paragraph which I have circled in label 1, quoting from the article, and this is a quote of Reverend Robertson. Quote, "We just happened to bump into each other," Robertson said about his encounter with North on September 13, 1985, at a private air terminal in Washington. He just happened to say, I'm going to Iran to meet some of the leadership to try to negotiate the release of some of our hostages, end quote. My question, Colonel North, do you recall that conversation with Reverend Roberts?
I do not, sir. I would also note that it goes on and it said that North asked the Reverend Robertson to pray for me. I have done that often, and am grateful for the prayers of many. I do not recall that conversation. I also note that if it was September 13th, 1985, it is well before we had made those plans. I don't believe that we actually addressed plans to go to Tehran until February of '86.
So you wouldn't have been going to Iran at that time?
So I only went once, and that was in May of '86, and my recollection is that those plans were laid down actually for 2 trips in February of 1986 during our first meetings face-to-face with the Iranian government officials.
So really this is an erroneous article, and Reverend Robertson's memory is not correct on this point.
Well, I'm not even sure that that's a quote from Reverend Robertson.
Well, if it is, I don't know either, but I'm just judging. If it is an accurate quote, it's in error.
It is an error, sir.
Thank you.
Senator Cohen.
Question, Mr. Chairman. Yeah. Is it the presentation or the circumstances under which the presentation was given at any particular time that's in question? If it's the presentation per se, then we should have the slideshow alone. But if it's the circumstances under which the presentation was given, it seems to me that we would have to consider calling the second punch, as Senator Rubman has talked about, and that would be under what circumstances followed the presentation, what was the relationship. So I'm perfectly prepared to have a presentation, but I think it has to be placed within the context under which it was given, if that's to present a fair picture of what took place in those given
Would the
times.
senator yield for the moment?
I'm certain you recall my statement at the time this matter was brought up, that in order to provide the appropriate aura and the flavor of that moment, we would have to call in Mr. Channel and Mr. Miller. And arrangements have been made to call upon Mr. Channel and Mr. Miller, and Mrs. Garwood, I believe it is.
Mr. Chairman, I'll just take 30 seconds. That's fine. That is fine with me. I think it's time that we get this out publicly and just plain give the Lieutenant Colonel a chance to explain what he did. That's what's important. I don't care what the others did. I'll be listening with great interest what they did. But I want to know what he did. And to be honest with you, I think he ought to have that opportunity to tell the American people. And I think the technological problems can be resolved, as Mr. Corder says, and it should be done.
Mr. Chairman,
Give us time to cool our souls and to cast our vote. We'll stand in recess for 10 minutes.